In the days of the giant transatlantic liners, the world's oceans were considered a highway to be traversed as speedily as possible. But in January 1997, ocean travel entered a new era when Carnival Destiny sailed into Miami for the first time. Never before had a cruise ship surpassed in size the largest ocean liner ever built, the Queen Elizabeth.
The central idea is the size of the ship, it's the scale of it. Everything that we have learned in the past on all the ships that we have done has been incorporated into this design.
In the long and extraordinary history of the ocean liner, Destiny is the first passenger ship to exceed 100,000 tons. In doing so, she's pushed the limits of marine technology into a new realm, the realm of the floating city.
What we're saying now is that these oceans can be used for development. And you'll find that after you use a ship, for example, as a floating city, there'll be multiple floating cities. This is the first step in what will be a further evolution of the use of the seas by man-made objects.
Up until the middle of the 20th century, virtually the only way to travel between continents was by ocean liner. For millions of travelers, wealthy and immigrant, the liners were a triumph of their time. Their enormous size, engineering sophistication, and interior splendor stirred the imagination of people everywhere.
These great liners are the biggest moving objects made by man. There's no thing in all history so big that is man-made which can move.
In the quest for profits and prestige, speed was the dominant factor. In 1907, the British ships Lusitania and Mauretania were the largest and fastest liners in the world, crossing the North Atlantic in 4.5 days. In the 1930s, a duel between the great French liner Normandy and Britain's Queen Mary reduced the North Atlantic passage to less than 4 days.
I remember as a boy, it was an American. The calendar, the jigsaw puzzle, the cookie box with pictures of the Queen Mary on it. She was a great national symbol, world symbol.
The only real challenge to the ocean liner came from the airship. By 1936, Germany was operating 2 airships across the Atlantic to New York and Rio. But the dream of a worldwide service collapsed in May 1937 when the Hindenburg blew up on its approach to land at New Jersey. Following the Second World War, military advances in flight were converted into commercial possibilities. Most travelers, however, still preferred the comfort and safety of a ship to the perils of flying. In 1952, a remarkable new American liner, the SS United States, cut 10 hours off the Queen Mary's Blue Ribbon record. But that same year, the de Havilland Comet ushered in a new era in travel, the jet age. In the coming decades, the giant ocean-going passenger liner, the great icon of industrial power and national prestige, would face the most dramatic struggle for survival in its long history. Well into the 1950s, Britain was still recovering from virtual bankruptcy following the Second World War. With half of her enormous fleet of liners and cargo ships destroyed in the conflict, shipyards were forced to scavenge for materials to rebuild the island nation's most important asset. At the same time, millions of Europeans, tired of post-war austerity, were flooding immigration offices, looking for any country that would accept them. Canada, New Zealand, South Africa and Australia were popular destinations. Desperate to increase its population, Australia actively encouraged British immigrants with a unique government-sponsored assisted passage scheme. A mere £10 sterling bought a chance for a new life in a new country for anyone prepared to sail halfway round the world.
You went really for weeks at a time. And not only weeks at a time, but through a vast change of climates, from the cold of the Channel to the heat of the Red Sea, and then back again to the cold of the passage south of Australia. The Atlantic has nothing to compare with it, and no length of duration of stay on board.
Ironically, many British immigrants couldn't be guaranteed passage on a British liner. Such was the sorry state of the nation's merchant fleet. But by the mid-1950s, British shipyards were back to their pre-war capacity. The oldest British line, P&O, and its subsidiary, the Orient Line, commissioned the building of the two largest passenger liners since the war. The 42,000-ton Oriana was the fastest liner built for the Britain to Australia run. The voyage to Sydney, that rarely took less than a month, was cut to 3 weeks. For her 2,050 passengers, Oriana's decor was modern and bright, and she offered the latest in entertainment technology.
You can take your choice for an evening's entertainment. The liner's lush plush cinema, or television in cozy viewing lounges, and in some of the cabins too.
At Harland and Wolff's Belfast Yard, the grandsons of men who'd built the Titanic half a century before were constructing a liner larger than Oriana. The 45,000-ton Canberra had accommodation for more passengers than any other liner afloat, and gave P&O Orient the final link in its quest to encircle the world with passenger liners. For the British shipworkers, Canberra and Oriana restored faith in the future. Faith that proved to be ill-founded. In 1958, international travel was revolutionized by the Boeing 707. The journey across the Atlantic Ocean could now be measured in hours, not days. An optimistic Cunard director suggested flying was a fad, and that there would always be passengers for great ships like the Queen's. But by the 1960s, sea travel not so much declined as collapsed. 95% of transatlantic travelers were now crossing by jet.
By the 60s, the two Queens were ghost ships, really. They were carrying next to no passengers most of the time. And most people at that time said, well, that's the end of the liners.
On May 11, 1960, the French line launched the France, a ship its owners predicted would revitalize interest in ocean travel. The French government had also hoped the new national flagship would help rebuild the country's morale following the recent loss of its African colony of Algeria.
Madame de Gaulle performed the christening ceremony.
At 1,035 feet in length, she was the longest ocean liner in the world, and possibly the most expensive propaganda exercise ever created in France. Unlike the exquisite French liners of the 1920s and 30s, the France's interiors were considered vulgar and tasteless. And, according to one critic, she was the greatest disappointment in the history of shipping.
But in revenge, of course, like all the French liners, it was reputed for its cuisine. And it's true that launching a dining, it was fantastic. I've kept a few menus myself.
At the time of her maiden voyage from Le Havre to New York, the jet had already proven itself unbeatable competition. At best, the France would cater to those who still yearned for a more leisurely and luxurious way to cross the ocean. But like all the other transatlantic liners of the 1960s, she was a financial disaster for her owners.
It is amazing looking back that people were building ships well into the 60s for transatlantic service when I guess the Boeing 707 was built in the middle 50s. So there was obviously not a great deal of foresight.
In late October 1967, the people of Southampton said an emotional final farewell to the most formidable ship of the century.
The Royal Pier was absolutely chock-a-block with people that day. She had this big, long paying-off pennant, 310 foot, with 10 foot for every year of service, that's what it was. You had the helicopter escort coming over the top. It was a great event.
From the people of the land of her birth, and from the Royal Navy came the final honor for the greatest merchant ship ever built. The Queen Mary had sailed from Britain, never again to return.
The Queen Mary's final voyage was her longest in peacetime. She sailed around Cape Horn to her new home at Long Beach, California.
On board, a farewell party for the 1,200 passengers. Overhead, a giant jet sweeps past in salute, a symbol of the future saying goodbye to the past.
When we arrived at Long Beach, I remember going up on deck by dawn's early light, and I was absolutely amazed at what I saw. Hundreds of little ships and bigger ships all around us. Hundreds.
The old lady has been bought by Long Beach for more than £1 million, the sum which in poverty-stricken Britain is not to be sneezed at. As the great ship makes her last landfall, a chapter of Atlantic history comes to an end.
The Queen Mary, perhaps the most popular ocean liner of all time, was to be preserved as a hotel and museum. A more dramatic fate, however, was in store for her fleetmate, the Queen Elizabeth. The world's largest liner was retired in 1968 and later sold to interests in the Orient who planned to convert her into a floating university. In 1972, she was destroyed by fire, allegedly lit by a saboteur. The two most famous liners ever built ships that had come to symbolize Britain's maritime power in war and peace were no more. The great Cunard Queens were dead. Despite the collapse of the transatlantic liner trade, Cunard was unwilling to admit defeat to the jet. Confronting bankruptcy and to the amazement of the skeptics, they built a new ship. A ship aimed at regaining the glory of Britain on the seas. In September 1967, tens of thousands of people gathered on the banks of the River Clyde to witness Queen Elizabeth II give her name to the third largest ocean liner built in Britain.
A launch is a peculiar thing because you're working with people who've maybe launched 200 boats in their career, and it's still got this peculiar, odd kind of emotional feeling. And I think it's got to do with the fact that you've worked on it and the fact that for 4 years you have been building this structure and you've watched it grow. And it's absolutely stable. It does not move, it does not creak, it does nothing. And then after the ceremony and a bottle of champagne smashed across the bows, there's about 4 seconds when nothing happens. Absolutely nothing. And it's the most electrifying, tense atmosphere. And suddenly you just see this thing weighing 40,000 tons just moving, and away it goes, and it literally is a mountain moving. And it just turns into this great awe-inspiring event, and it takes to the water, and it's light, and it's mobile, and suddenly it's got a life of its own. And you know, that is what a birth is all about. Suddenly it works, it's real, it is alive, it has got dynamism, and we built that, you know.
The Queen Elizabeth II, just before she sailed on her maiden Atlantic crossing. It was an occasion for streamers, balloons, and happy farewells.
In May 1969, the QE2 set out on her maiden voyage to New York. Unlike the ships of old, it wouldn't be a record-breaking crossing. The quest for speed was irrelevant in the jet age. Critics suggested she was sailing into an uncertain future. But rather than the last gasp of a dying mode of transport, Cunard saw the QE2 as the next step in the evolution of ship design and usage. In the winter months, she was to be taken off the transatlantic service to take short pleasure voyages to the tropics and a 3-month round-the-world voyage. Cunard was going cruising.
Cruising is really shipboard for the fun of it.
Cruising wasn't a new idea. For more than 100 years, hard-pressed shipping lines saw cruises as a way to keep their liners in service during lean times. Early cruises were often for the more adventurous. As one advertisement called them, the educational and scientific-oriented travellers. The first great cruising boom came, ironically, during the Great Economic Depression of the 1930s. Loss-making Atlantic liners headed for the more profitable waters of the Caribbean, filled to the brim with New York stenographers, bank clerks, and honeymooners. Cheapest of all were the overnight booze cruises to nowhere, offering open bars to thirsty Americans tired of alcohol prohibition.
Those booze cruises, one-nighters led to 3-nighters, led to 5-nighters, led to 7-nighters and 10-nighters, and it just grew. So that was the beginning of cruising for the masses as we know it today.
Here are the first pictures of a terrible tragedy of the sea, equaled only by those of the Titanic and Lusitania. It's dawn, and the ward liner Morro Castle lies helpless in a storm-swept sea 8 miles from the American coast.
The loss of the cruise ship Morro Castle to fire in September 1934 shook American opinion. The failure of fire-detecting equipment on what was supposedly one of the world's safest ships forced changes to United States maritime laws. Thousands watched the tragedy from the New Jersey coast as survivors were washed ashore by the heavy seas. The loss of 130 people in the disaster seriously dampened America's interest in cruising. In the late 1940s, the appeal of cruising was restored by the Caronia, Cunard's first purpose-built cruise ship. Painted in 4 shades of green, she became known as the Green Goddess, offering Mediterranean and Scandinavian excursions as well as round-the-world cruises in stunning luxury.
She was so select that you couldn't buy a segment. On Caronia, you bought the whole trip, or not at all. People used to, on the Caronia, sometimes bring paintings and furniture. They'd cruise around the world with to make the cabin their own.
Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the P&O Orient Line ships surrendered the croquet court to the swimming pool and shifted the image of cruising from luxury to the comforts of home and organized leisure. Cruising was no longer seen as a stopgap in lean times, but a means to make real money.
Hawaii is the home of the hula dance, in which every movement means a powerful lot.
Cruise directors now attempted to choreograph every aspect of the adventure for their new breed of seagoers, people to whom the old, conservative standards of an ocean voyage were unknown or meaningless. As evening dress gave way to the sports shirt and bikini, the after-dinner dance gave way to what author John Malcolm Rinnan described as a house party with its connotations of a sexual raffle. But somehow, out of the countless ways to describe cruising, the shipping lines decided on a single evocative word: romantic.
I honestly think there is nothing like a walk round the open decks late at night with a moon and, full moon that just seems to hit the parts that other things don't seem to reach. And by golly, it happens all the time.
There's one terribly sad story of a woman who invested all of her life savings in a round-the-world cruise on the Caronia in search of a man. Well, there were no men. There were a lot of widows, there were a lot of couples, but there were no bachelors looking to be swept off their feet. And she jumped over the side.
As the QE2 prepared to set out on her inaugural cruise to the Caribbean, the romance of transatlantic travel was coming to an end. The world's fastest liner, the United States, would be decommissioned in the autumn of 1969. And within a few years, the world's longest passenger ship, the France, would also be in mothballs. The relationship between the ocean liner and New York was all but over, and cruising wasn't going to save it. Sailing from New York for 2 days before reaching the sun had always been impractical. Elsewhere, however, a new unlikely candidate was emerging to challenge New York as the world's busiest passenger port.
I remember looking at brochures in the 60s for little old veteran relic cruise ships like the Evangeline and the Bahama Star offering $59 cruises to the Bahamas, and I would say to ourselves, but who would sail from Miami? What a strange place to go from.
Miami, a city where money and imagination fused to create a mecca for holidaymakers in the 1920s and 30s. The architecture of its beachside district was influenced by the floating temples of Art Deco, the ocean liner. In the late 1960s, Miami was the scene of a revolution in cruising. A revolution that would save the ocean liner from extinction. Only half a day's sailing to the sunny Caribbean, a new breed of shipping entrepreneurs began to capitalize on Miami's huge geographical advantage over New York. Today's leading cruise line, Carnival, had an inauspicious start in the early 1970s with Mardi Gras, formerly the Empress of Canada. On her maiden voyage, she ran aground.
So the first year and a half or so, we had lost $8 million. It was positioned by the marketing people that were there at that time as the flagship of the Golden Fleet. It wasn't golden and there was no fleet, and it was just a disaster.
But by the mid-1970s, Carnival was making a profit and soon had 3 ships to its name, including the largest cruise ship sailing the Caribbean, the 38,000-ton Festival. But in the late 1970s, Knut Kloster of Norwegian Cruise Lines stunned his Miami competitors when he purchased the derelict superliner, the France, and spent millions refurbishing her.
When Kloster said, I'm going to buy the France, this superannuated French line vessel that had been lingering in layup at Le Havre for 5 years, I'm going to buy this ship and transform it into a cruise ship, people thought he was mad.
Renamed the Norway, the largest passenger ship in the world would now be sailing from Miami, not from Le Havre, Southampton, or New York.
The time the Norway steamed into Miami in June of 1980, there were no ships approaching her. She was the first. She was a pioneer. And in a sense, the cruise industry owes him a debt for that kind of vision and enterprise.
In the early 1980s, competition for the cruising dollar exploded, spawning the greatest output of new passenger ships since World War II. Carnival led the race with 4 specially built cruise liners, 3 of which, at 40,000 tons, were larger than the Lusitania. At the same time, Carnival made an all-out assault on the long-held American perception of cruising as the privilege of the wealthy and elderly.
The passengers back then, the average age, we say kiddingly, was deceased. Cruising was for old people and their parents. And consciously over the next 3 or 4 years at Carnival, one of the things that we did, we think was a bit different, was to encourage people of all ages to come on board a cruise ship. So we purposely marketed to people under the age of death.
In the morning, in the evening, ain't we got fun? Not much money, oh, but honey, ain't we got fun?
They were looking for the lowest plankton in the food chain of the cruise ocean. They were going for anybody who would buy a ticket.
Sunny weather, all together, we've got the fun.
And they marketed cruises all over America in a way that had never been done before. And over the years, they have succeeded beyond anybody's wildest expectation.
In the 1990s, Carnival introduced to its fleet an extraordinary superliner constructed in Finland. The 70,000-ton, 2,000-passenger Fantasy was larger than the Norway. What stunned the competition was that Fantasy was not a one-off. but the first of 8 to be built from the same basic design. Never before in maritime history had a shipping line the confidence and financial means to create such a spectacular fleet. Designed by Miami ship architect Joe Farkas, the interiors of each ship in the series would be unique, but together offer a new philosophy of marine architecture that the traditionalist would hate and the cruising public love.
What I'm trying to do is to take people out of their living rooms and put them into a very special environment. I don't want people to take the architecture for granted. I think that if you give people different feelings and details to look at, that they will be in a constant discovery process throughout the whole cruise. I think that's interesting, and I think when people are interested, that helps them to have a good time. I call it entertainment architecture.
The ship's 6-story grand atriums were revolutionary and would influence cruise ship design forevermore.
It's almost like putting yourself into a movie set where the passengers or our guests are the actors and the movie is a 3, 4, 7-day cruise.
The thing about Carnival that you sense when you get on board their ships, the thing that is almost palpable is their success. You cannot argue with it. They have now, I think, 30–35% of the market, and that's a big chunk of business.
Today, the busiest passenger port in the world is not New York, but Miami. And the jet airliner, once the enemy of the transatlantic liner, is now the cruise industry's greatest ally.
The jetliners today bring the people to the ships, so they're a very important partner to the cruise industry. We work very closely together. Our company alone, just Carnival Cruise Lines, will do about $175 million of airline ticket purchases this year.
Every weekend, up to 40,000 people pass through Miami, bound for the Caribbean, on one of a dozen or more cruise ships. And the competition for market share has seen Royal Caribbean Lines match Carnival with its own fleet of superliners.
In terms of economy of scale, it works to the cruise line's advantage to have larger ships. They're more economical to operate, they're more profitable. There was always a concern by cruise lines that perhaps our guests didn't want to be sharing their vacation with thousands of other people.
I need a man with no shirt on, wearing a bra, lipstick, anything you can think of to make that man look good.
Although we found now that the response is that the ships are designed in such a way that the guests seem to quite enjoy being with many other people, even though there can be 2,000 or even more people together enjoying a cruise vacation.
You're riding a little high there, aren't you? But very nice. The shoe sets everything off, matches the bra.
They are what they should be. They're floating hotels. For the Midwestern couples that come on, and that's the bulk of your trade, you know, they're not all the sophisticates of New York or LA. This is this most wonderful world. They're not interested in a ship rolling or motion at sea. They want to feel like they're in a floating resort.
In the first decade of the 21st century, more than 50 million people are expected to cruise the Caribbean, making it the busiest and most profitable ocean destination on the planet.
The problem with the Caribbean, it has attracted so many ships, and such large ships, that some islands are being overwhelmed. There are 3, 4, 5 ships every day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. What happens to an island like that? Well, gets very jaded. The people get very inured to a lot of inquisitive, rude, noisy passengers coming ashore, demanding this, demanding that. And it is conceived by the port authorities and the governments of these islands that if we could only get cruise ships to come, all our problems will be solved. Well, it's solved for certain numbers of people, certain numbers of merchants and entrepreneurs, but not for general populace.
These large ships going there make a big contribution to these islands. At the same time, they do, I don't want to say cause problems, but when some of the smaller islands, you put one of these large ships here, it almost equals the size of the island.
It's crowds, it's jams, it's all the things that the island should not really be. It should be more serene and more tranquil and more welcoming, but instead it's sort of mass downtown USA kind of thing.
With most Caribbean ports close to saturation, some of the major cruise lines invested millions of dollars to secure their own piece of paradise.
In the last 20 or so years, one of the big things in the Caribbean is to have a private island. They call it a private island. They lease the space from an island government, the Bahamas or Haiti or whatever, and they give you a day at a private beach. It's all set up beautifully with water sports equipment and so forth.
Away from the crowded and expensive ports, cruise passengers experience, according to the lines, an exclusive, unspoiled paradise which they could not visit in any other way. Far from the competitive and overrun Caribbean, an ocean cruise has another meaning. And in the quest for their own market niche, some lines set out to attract more sophisticated travelers by offering voyages to isolated destinations that can best be appreciated from the sea.
Essentially, the business of cruising is the interaction of the ship with land. There's nothing pleasanter than sitting on the deck of a ship and watching a mountain range go by.
Cruising is now a global enterprise, and more people are experiencing an ocean voyage than at any time in history. As diverse as the itineraries available is the array of ships. From sublime sailing vessels to superliners carrying up to 5,000 passengers and crew.
In a sense, the high glamour of yesteryear, the Lalique of the Normandy and the white dogs on the sun deck and the steamer trunks, that's gone. But the creature comforts are here today that are so wonderful. You have to remember that the Queen Mary, for example, even in first class, there weren't private bathrooms in all the cabins. You had to go down the hall. Today you've got television in your room, you've got vacuum flush toilets, you've got bars and hair dryers and climatically controlled air conditioning. The ships today are more creature comfortable than the ships of yesteryear.
Unlike the giant transatlantic liners of yesteryear, cruise ships are slow, calm water vessels, not built for speed or the rigors of a pounding sea. But like the liners of old, today's cruise ships could still find themselves in dangerous waters. As recently as 1982, when Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, the British government seconded passenger ships for use as troop ships.
At Southampton docks, soldiers and supplies have been arriving at the cruise liner Canberra, ready for the journey south.
Filled with 3,000 commandos and a volunteer crew, Canberra sailed for the southern Atlantic, still in her civilian colours. Hundreds of British liners had been used as troop ships in wars past, but this was the first time a dedicated cruise ship had ever spearheaded such a daring assault. After weeks at sea, Canberra sailed into the war zone and within striking range of the crack Argentinian Air Force.
major fear was that we would be hit by bombs or an exocet. The ship's superstructure was built of aluminium, and fire would have been our worst hazard, and that is what we worried about. There was only one night we didn't have a drink with dinner. Wine with dinner was the night we went into San Carlos.
Admiral Woodward's daring in bringing Canberra close inshore paid off. Despite repeated air raids, the Argentine Air Force failed to get through as she disembarked hundreds of troops.
More than 10,000 British troops were transported to the Falklands on 5 passenger ships, one of which was the most prestigious liner afloat.
At precisely 4 o'clock, the QE2 slipped her moorings. By now, thousands were there to wave an emotional farewell.
Unlike his counterpart on the Canberra, the QE2's captain sailed for the Falklands in the knowledge that his ship was not to enter the war zone.
She couldn't really be exposed to danger. The thought of risking losing the ship that had the same name of the sovereign was more than the politicians could bear. The fact that the Canberra was exposed didn't really matter, actually. After all, it was only the capital of Australia.
Despite the dangers, Canberra came through the war unscathed. The Great White Whale, as she became known, along with the QE2, would join the honour roll of legendary British liners that had sailed into battle for Queen and country.
But if those 2 big ships had not been available for requisition on the British Register, it would have been a very, very different operation and might not even have succeeded.
The Falklands War was a potent reminder that even ships built for the gentle art of cruising could find themselves embroiled and even sacrificed in future conflicts.
We are part of the backup fleet for the NATO forces. If there was a need ever again, it's our fleets, our container ships and our big passenger ships which will be immediately swing into action.
If it's a war of any magnitude, people are not going to be thinking about cruising. But the reality, I think, is that we're looking at more isolated occurrences like we had in the Falklands. And if the United States was involved and if they needed our assistance, we would do everything in our power to help.
The days when national jealousies saw countries build liners for war as well as peace are over. But today, cruising is one of the fastest growing and most profitable sectors of the world leisure market. And many of the old rival maritime nations have become embroiled in this new race for dominance of the seas.
In the 70s, there were 17 new ships built. In the 80s were 34. And in the 90s, over 50.
Royal Caribbean Line's 77,000-ton Rhapsody of the Seas was built at the same French shipyard as the elegant liner of the 1930s, Normandy. And the country that first challenged Britain's stranglehold over the ocean liner trade a century ago, Germany, has now some of the most technologically advanced shipbuilding facilities in the world. Old antagonisms long forgotten, British P&O's cruise ship Oriana was constructed at the Meyer Werft shipyard at Papenburg. But the country that dominated shipbuilding from the earliest days of steam, Britain, is out of the race. The nation that gave the world some of the greatest ocean liners ever built hasn't constructed a passenger ship since the QE2.
It didn't take very long in not building them before they lost the capability to build them. And with a 20-year gap between the traditional liner market and the emergence of the new cruise liner market, by the time that came on stream, the British shipyards had changed their product mix and their skills and their expertise in a direction that made it really quite impossible for them to get back into the new liner market in any meaningful way.
Today, the world's preeminent cruise ship builder is Italy. Fincantieri shipyard near Trieste has alone captured more than 40% of all new building orders, including 2 spectacular ships for the entertainment giant Disney. The Disney ships will embrace the traditional lines of the classic ocean liners of yesteryear, and their interiors will be unlike anything ever to go to sea.
The Disney ships, which have 2 smokestacks, look like Popular Mechanics of the 1950s. That was a magazine that had a lot to do with what the future was going to look like in the 60s. Well, they have that sort of futuristic look about them, and I kind of like that. I think that works, and I think that Mr. and Mrs. Public likes that too.
In its first foray into cruising, Disney promises to redefine the experience of an ocean voyage by extending its theme park empire onto the largest playground on the planet. In the annals of maritime history, the last decade of the 20th century will be remembered as a watershed, a time when cruise ship construction outstripped the traditional ocean liner, both in output and size. In 1993, Fincantieri began construction on the most extraordinary cruise ship of the century.
The central idea is the size of the ship, it's the scale of it.
When the 101,000-ton Carnival Destiny entered service in January 1997, it marked a new era. For the first time, a cruise ship had eclipsed in size the largest transatlantic liner ever built, the Queen Elizabeth.
I don't know, it's a few dozen 747s at one time. I mean, it's just a massive, it's a city at sea. And it's going to be a city that people are going to have an absolutely fabulous time.
For its 3,000 passengers, Destiny is a place on the high seas where ship and destination merge. But its sheer size has generated both a heightened mix of expectation and skepticism.
The lights you see on the wall are handmade Venetian glass panels that are...
To market Destiny, Carnival invited press and travel agents on a pre-maiden voyage of the $400 million ship.
It's fun.
What they discovered was that the market leader had brashly forced the boundaries of cruise ship design yet again.
The ship is fine. It's a little bit garish. It's a Vegas theme, Orlando theme, orange, purples, young crowd. It's a 70 million person market in Vegas and Orlando every year. That's what they're trying to capture, and they do a very good job of that.
Their mindset is that it's like a city self-contained. The bigger the better as far as the public's concerned.
In its first year, Destiny overturned industry perceptions of how big is too big. It proved such a spectacular success that the company ordered 2 more ships in the series. But in doing so, it is set to play a game of one-upmanship for size, unparalleled since the heyday of the ocean liner. Carnival's fiercest competitors, Royal Caribbean Lines and P&O's Princess Line, immediately announced the building of cruise ships larger than Destiny. Royal Caribbean's billion-dollar Project Eagle will see the construction of not 1, but 2 130,000-ton megaliners.
We're in the period of the largest big liner construction of all time, far greater than ever happened before.
Next year, the Queen Elizabeth will no longer even be in the top 25 largest liners because there were so many big cruise ships coming out.
But I think ships will get larger, and there will be more amenities, and there will be more choice that are offered to the traveling public. Where it will end is difficult to say.
Already on the drawing board are vessels that will dwarf even the largest cruise ships and propel the evolution of passenger ships into a new realm.
This ship would be 250,000 gross registered tons, and that's well over twice the biggest ones on the drawing board and more than 3 times larger than the biggest ship operating today. Be a quarter of a mile long. She's taller than the Statue of Liberty. This is not a race for size. It's not an effort to set records or anything of that sort. This is distinctly a new generation, market-driven product, which is designed not as a cruise ship. It goes past that evolution in the use of passenger ships to a new stage. This is a city ship, and it is designed to appeal to any market that a city would appeal to. Probably the cost of the ship will be on the order of $1,200 million.
The America World City project is the concept of Knut Kloster, the pioneer of the contemporary cruise industry, who proved the skeptics wrong when he took the France and turned it into the world's first super cruise ship. In America World City, Kloster has created a ship that will accommodate 8,600 passengers and crew, a vessel 2.5 times the size of Destiny, and possibly the most dramatic development on the high seas since steam took over from sail.
What we're saying now is that these oceans can be used for development. And you'll find that after you use a ship, for example, as a floating city, there'll be multiple floating cities. This is the precursor. This is the first step in what will be a further evolution of the use of the seas by man-made objects.
It was once thought that the jet airliner would bring the end for the ocean liner. But today, a new breed of passenger ship is plying the oceans of the world, carrying more people than ever before. And in a highly competitive race to win over the hearts and minds of future voyagers, a new generation of ship owners and designers is pushing human ingenuity and technology to their limits.
Think about all of the massive buildings of the present and the past, the pyramids and the Sphinx. Cruise ships are still absolutely the largest buildings devised and developed and constructed by man. The largest things that we're going to see for a long time to come, I believe.
Thank goodness the cruise ships are about, because the world would be certainly an older and a colder place if the big old superliners weren't around. Long may big ships continue.
We may see that now is just the beginning of the great liner, instead of the end of a great liner period.
In the era of the giant cruise ship, the ocean is no longer considered merely a highway, but a destination in itself. And from over the endless horizon, new wonders of the world are certain to appear. In the wake of those great ships that changed the world, the liners.